Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology from the ground down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Good morning, people. This is Biblical Archaeology from the ground down. I'm your host, Dr. George Sparks. With me today, I have Dr. David Graves and also Dr. Craig Olsen. Dr. Olsen received his PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary, and Dr. David Graves received his PhD from Aberdeen University in Scotland. Today, we're going to have a very interesting podcast discussing Dr. Olsen's book. It's entitled, How Old Was Father Abraham? The Genesis Lifespan in the Light of Archaeology. So what does that mean? It means we're going to look at the early biblical dates given to patriarchs in the book of Genesis, at least initially. So this is going to be very interesting. Also, it could be controversial. And we know that, and we discussed it before we started the program. So for those that listen, if you would, send your comments. You're welcome. If you agree, fine. If you don't agree, fine. Either way, if you need to be very literal about the biblical dates, let us know. For those that say, well, in some cases, that might be some type of honorific date or symbolic date. Chime in, let us know. At this time, let me turn it over to Dr. Graves. You're going to start off with your PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yes, George. Good to be with you again today, and this should be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about the Sumerian Kings list. Let me just get things started here.
And while you're putting it up, why are we heading to the Sumerian King list?
Good question. Well, we need to actually look at archaeology to start with. Ancient Near Eastern people thought about numbers because if we don't understand how the ancient people thought about numbers, we're not going to understand the Bible, the biblical text, especially those early passages. So we're going to jump in. This is the Sumerian Kings list here on the left, the photograph I took of it. At the museum, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. That's where I was teaching a class and did some research on this. It's also called the Wells-Blundell Prism. It's based on my book, this particular part of it on the archaeology of the Old Testament. And Craig has his book that he's going to be talking about as well. I've got some material on my key themes of the Old Testament as well. The Sumerian Kings list was discovered in Nippur and Larsa. There's actually different copies of it. Fragments discovered in 1906. And this tablet was donated in 1922 by Herbert Blundell, and that's where we get the Blundell prism from, the idea that a lot of times something that's discovered gets named after the individual that found it. There are 16 copies of the text are known. So this is not just based on one text. And as I said, it's in the Ashmolean Museum. And the significance is that we have similar numbers in the scripture. That's the oldest known outline of world history, written about 100 years before Abraham, 2170 BC, discovered in 1922, and it lists 10 kings before the flood with extremely long reigns. The list was inscribed during the reign of that individual, Olsen. Those are the dates, 1816 to 1794 BC. We're not talking AD there. And it's a list of the kings from the beginning of history when kingship was first handed down from heaven, as they called it and described it. The inscription was done only a few years before Hammurabi of Babylon captured the land in the first half of the 18th century BC and added it to a province to his new kingdom, a new empire called Babylonia. It's a complete list of the kings of the land of Sumer. And the earliest section of the book of Genesis in the Old Testament parallels this part of the Sumerian. The pattern parallels it.
Yeah.
Not the people, but the pattern. Not only are these close parallels, the pattern with the biblical flood story, but also of the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. So we have a flood story outside of the Bible. We have a list of people living very long, flood, and then very short. And I'll show the dates here in a moment to give you an idea. And we have these superhuman lifespans given there, which decrease after the flood. They're comparable to those in the inscription on this prism. Zazudra is the hero of the Eridu Genesis and is mentioned in the Sumerian Kings list as well. We talked about the Zazudra epic, the Eridu epic early cast, and people can look that up and see those tablets. So here are the 10 patriarchs prior to the flood as described in Genesis 5. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Jared, Enosh, and Methuselah. Now you'll see the years that are described in the Bible are very, very long. Most are 900 or so years. Enoch, of course, is the exception because he was taken up into heaven. Lamech and Noah, 950.
Mhm.
Then we have the flood. Noah and the flood. But after the flood, what do we find? And you're going to argue, Craig, these are honorific representations, and I agree with you on this. After the flood, Abraham is 175, 120 for Moses. Psalm 90 says
70 years.
70 years. So again, that's the pattern we find in Genesis.
Yeah,
Well-
if I could just jump in here, David, and thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be here on this podcast. And I'm glad you put this up here, David, and this is exactly what we're looking at. Because the Sumerian king list follows exactly the same pattern, 10 kings before the flood.
Yep.
But their reigns are much, much longer.
I'll show those in a moment, the next slide.
Oh, really? Yeah, all around 36,000 years. But they all fit a pattern. They're all multiples of either 60 or 60 times 60. And here, these 10, the numbers that you put up also fit a pattern. They're all multiples of 5 or multiples of 5 with the addition of 7. And so you'll notice that every number only ends in a 0, 2, 5, or a 7. And so they our argument is these are not actual lifespans. If you ask a group of 10 people their ages, you won't get every number ending in 0, 2, 5, or 7. You'll have a random distribution, which is not what we see in Scripture. Now,
Right.
you might say, Dr. Olsen, you're wrong. Methuselah, his lifespan ends in a 9. But actually, the total of the lifespan in Genesis 5 is simply the product of adding two numbers together, the numbers before children arrived and the numbers after children arrived. And those two do fit the pattern. It's just that when you add them together, it ends in a 9. So all of these numbers here that you can see do fit a numerical pattern, showing us even from the Bible itself that they're following the pattern that was used during their time frame, like the Sumerian King list, not the way we use numbers during our time frame. And so I'm glad you mentioned that right at the start, David, is that we need to interpret and understand what did people understand or when they read these numbers back in their day, not reading it through our modernistic interpretation.
Yes. So here's the Sumerian Kings list. These are not their ages. These are the years of their rule or reign. So 28,000 years. So here's all their names. I'm not going to try and pronounce them all. They're hard to pronounce. But you get a sense here of all the different. So 36,000, 43,000, 28,000, 30. So here we have long rules. And none of us we would all agree that there's no way that these are literal years. There's no way that someone lived for 28,000 years. 16. But look what happens. Totals 241,000 years. But then we have this described in the tablet, the Sumerian King's list. The flood swept over the land. After the flood had swept over the land, the kingship had descended from heaven for a second time. Kish became the seat of kingship. And then what happens? Then it lists the years of rule. Ajukur, 1200, 900, 670, 420, 300, 840, and 960. So we have large rains, flood, and small rains. So the pattern mirrors exactly what we find in the book of Genesis. And there's 5,350 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
I'm just wanted to confirm exactly what you're saying. It's the same pattern. Now, the lifespans are different. In Genesis, before the flood, no one reaches 1,000. Everyone's over 900, but no one reaches 1,000. And they were not kings; they were men. And they died. It says that very clearly. But then after the flood, you have this decreasing lifespans, exactly like this, coming closer to the author's time frame where people lived more normal lifespans.
Yes. So what we say is there's something going on in the ancient Near Eastern mind to cause them to represent their numbers, unlike we tend to use numbers in the Greco-Roman context today, back in those days. So we're going to explore that a little bit. The longevity was believed to have been greater before the flood, and that's attested among the Sumerians as well as the biblical record. The longevity of the Sumerian rulers is reduced as the historical period is reached. Now, Berosus, who was an ancient writer, listed it as 432,000 years. The Sumerian King's list says it's that number. But what it shows is that we have a sigmoid curve. And this is something that you can do scientifically, as we have the longevity spans and the date of the birth and the years. And you compare this on a graph. What happens is that, and there's a journal article, and I quote here, Lopez, Journal of Creation. In general, we can see that the age at death was very high and fairly uniform for 1.5 millennia during the antediluvian period, that's before the flood. After a major worldwide catastrophe, the flood, the previous longevity was rapidly and drastically reduced, about 80%, during a relatively short period of time, a couple of centuries, and age at death slowly drops to more historical longevity values over a period of about 1,500 years. So there's a pattern here that is definitely identified, recordable, and paralleled in Scripture. So the data points define very closely a sigmoid curve typical of the process that are intentionally stable, go through a period of rapid monotonic change, and slowly stabilize again at a much different value. Now, this orderly pattern and sharp regularity of the lifespan data with time does not support the contention that the Old Testament longevity values are willfully assigned randomly or random figures or represent obscure mythological remnants of a dim past. they were done on purpose. But what we say, and Craig, you can perhaps explain this better than I can, the sexagesimal system that the Sumerians and the Babylonians used for their numbering system.
Yeah, exactly. So the first numbering system that was ever invented is the sexagesimal system, which is a base 60 system.
Yes.
And people think, well, that sounds really complicated, but actually it's not. We still use it today.
Right.
It's brilliant. We know that there are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. We know that in longitude and latitude, it's base 60. We know there are 360 degrees in a circle. And so because 60 is the first number that's divisible by 1 through 6, and 10, and 12, and 15, and 20, and 30. And so it's brilliant. And so in the ancient Sumerian king list and the Babylonian culture, base 60 was their means of numbering, and their ideal lifespan was 120, 60 plus 60. And so when they're giving these numbers to their ancient kings, they all knew that people don't live for 36,000 years. They knew that these were honorific numbers. These were symbolic numbers designed to give honor, we think, to give honor to their ancestors. We know that these, in the Sumerian king list, were real kings. They were actual people. Mm-hmm. They were probably more contemporaries than one after the other because they lived in city-states. But they were real people, but this was a way for the ancient world to say, these are our ancestors, we want to honor them, we want to remember them. And the way we're doing that is through these, the length of their reigns, which is a multiple of 60, or 60 times 60, 3,600. And so we see the same thing in Scripture. And the same thing in Scripture before Genesis 5, or in Genesis 5, I should say, and even afterwards, throughout the lifespans of Genesis, the lifespans that they were assigned, like as we mentioned, don't fit a random sample that you would expect if they were actual lifespans. Instead, yes, part of a formula. In this case, it's more probably base 10, because Moses grew up in Egypt, where base 10 was used, not base 60, but they're divisible by 5 or divisible by 5 with the addition of the sacred number 7. And they fit the same pattern. You have these long lifespans before the flood, and then the sigmoid curve transitioning down in Genesis 11 to once you reach the patriarchs. But even then, through the patriarchs, and as you pointed out, even to Moses, and some people later on, Levi, Joshua, their lifespans fit the same pattern. Mm-hmm. And it was a way of giving people honor, of saying, these are our ancestors, we don't want to forget them, we want to remember them, and we want to honor them.
Now, Craig, some may argue that, well, that's just one tablet, or maybe a number of tablets recorded that speak of things in this way. But there are some other examples, and I just popped up another one here, the Turin Kings list. So we have other lists of kings. Do they do the same thing?
Exactly. The Turin canon is a great example. It starts off with these exaggerated lifespans at the beginning. Now, the Turin canon from Egypt is a little bit different. The two at the beginning, they say, are gods or demigods. And they give them lifespans of exaggerated lifespans of 7,726 or 7,718. And then later on, once they get to the historical kings, they seem to be more normal reigns, normal lifespans, and not exaggerated. So there's the Turin king list, and there's the rulers of Lagash is another king list, and they do fit a pattern. But what you don't find is in the ancient world genealogies where they put in the actual lifespan the way that we do today. Now that's very rare. You do find that a common format, a common pattern is to give these exaggerated reigns or lifespans.
So they weren't really tied into birthdays.
Right, right. Now in Scripture, they do celebrate Pharaoh's birthday, and later on Caesar's birthday. But people don't celebrate birthdays typically in Scripture. Now, and maybe it was just the Pharaoh was the only one who was important enough to really think about his birthday. And you've got to remember, people in those times, they didn't have a name for the year like we do. Like we're, the year that we have. They didn't have a name for the decade, like the 80s. We talk about the 80s when I grew up.
Right.
They didn't have a name for the century, like the 20th century or the 21st century. They didn't have a name for the era. We talk about the early Bronze Age or the middle Bronze Age. They didn't do that. They didn't number. The way they recorded time was the such and such year of such and such king. So, all right. So it's in relation to a king, but they didn't relate that to an overall timeline of history. And so the idea that these shepherds living in tents came up with this extremely accurate modernistic timeline of history is simply not borne out by the evidence. It's not supported by the evidence, because this is what we see. We see these exaggerated reigns or lifespans when they're talking about their ancestors.
Right. Now here's as we get into the Genesis genealogy, I popped this up. It's a chart. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the scribes making changes to correct perceived difficulties. Now, this is pretty complicated, and you deal with this in your book, I think?
Not really. I go pretty much from the Masoretic text with the assumption that the text that's behind the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text that later became the Masoretic text, is probably the original. Some people think the text behind the Septuagint translation is more original. It doesn't matter. Either one fits the pattern. Either one, the numbers are divisible by 5 or divisible by 5 with the addition of 7. And so...
But maybe you could address some of the differences that we have in the different texts and why they might be there. We look at Adam, Septuagint is 700 years. We have Lamech 777, 65. That's a bit complicated maybe for our audience, but it's worth noting that you've looked into this, I think.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting there are different versions of the Sumerian King list as well, with different numbers in as well, and their way of keeping track and making copies of these different lists. They're keeping to accuracy was not as important to them as it is to us today. If I ask somebody today, how old are you? I expect them to give me exactly their age to the year and that they have a birth certificate to prove that. In the ancient world, they didn't have that.
Right.
They didn't, go by they didn't use numbers in the same way.
Until we get into the Roman period, which is different, but we're talking about these early periods.
Yeah. In fact, I even did, the studies show that no one even prepared a chronology, what we think of as a chronology, until we get to the Greek period, a couple of hundred years before Christ. Right. So I don't just mean no one in the ancient Near East, I mean no one anywhere in the world ever kept a chronology. So the idea that these numbers here were recorded as a chronological, that we're supposed to take these numbers and add them together to find the date of when these people lived, is anachronistic. It simply was not practiced during that time. And so you're arguing that somehow this one group of people, the Israelites, somehow did something that none of their neighbors anywhere around them were doing, and nobody would do for at least another 1,000 years, maybe longer.
Yes.
The pattern that we see in the ancient world is that these lifespans or reigns were symbolic, they were honorific, they were to give honor and to remember and memorialize their ancestors. And usually there was a list of 10. The Sumerian King list has 10 before the flood, just like the Bible has 10 before the flood. And then in Genesis 11, another 10. And then, so that's very, very common format.
Canaan is a bit of an anomaly here with the Septuagint. Some might discover that and ask the question, why is the Septuagint listing 130 and 330 for the account here in Genesis 11?
Right.
Could you maybe address that a little bit?
He's not even in the Masoretic text.
Right.
Yeah, so yes, people. Some argue that the text behind the Septuagint is more original than the text behind the Masoretic. I don't follow that. I think the Hebrew text that led to the Masoretic text is probably more original, and the reason is because in textual criticism, the rules are the more complicated and the shorter interpretation is more original. The tendency was for scribes over time to try and explain passages that were capable of being misunderstood or that weren't understood very well. And Septuagint numbers, you see these people after the flood. The Septuagint added 100 years to the time before they had children. So Archaeology 130 instead of 30. And if you go back to that other slide, so they added 100 years to the people before the flood, and that smooths everything out. If you go from the Septuagint, the numbers in the Masoretic text, then after the flood, and if you assume there are no gaps, which some people assume, I think there are gaps in these genealogies, but some people assume there are no gaps. If you think these are actual lifespans after the flood, and the next slide that you had up shows this, and yeah, these guys. And if you assume there are no gaps, then there are 4 people still alive during Abraham's lifespan, and 2 of them outlive Abraham, which doesn't make sense because Abraham is the first person in Scripture called old. It says Abraham lived a full life and died an old man, full of years. Well, that does in Genesis 25:8. Well, that doesn't make sense if his ancestors, not even ancient ancestors, if his ancestors are still living when he goes into Canaan, some of them still living when he passes away. And even if you put gaps in there, it still doesn't solve the problem. He's not old at all. 175 years. He's a mere youngster compared to his ancestors. But yet Scripture calls him old.
So I'll say this, Craig. If you have to take these numbers then as literal, you have to tie yourself in a knot to try and explain them.
Exactly. Because not only does it not make sense within Scripture, it also doesn't make sense outside of Scripture. People have done archaeology at hundreds of sites in dozens of countries, people from evangelical Christians to liberal Christians to Jewish people to Muslim people to atheists. All kinds of people have done archaeology and have dug up hundreds and hundreds of skeletons. And there's no evidence that people lived longer lifespans than today. They lived shorter lifespans, mostly, on average around 30 or 40 years was the lifespan in ancient time. So some lived longer, 50 or 60, but nobody lived 175. Nobody lived 900 years. There's no evidence of that happening. And if you take the chronology, taking these lifespans at face value, then the chronology ends up putting the patriarchs living at a time that they could not have lived. The archaeology doesn't match. The cities are literally not there.
Now, Craig, I know that, and just for the audience to understand, Craig and I go way back. We dug together Tel Hammam and good friends. So we're not strangers to one another. But I can just hear some people, their eyebrows rising and saying, well, you can't do that because that's going to affect your idea of biblical inerrancy and the infallibility of Scripture. So what's your response to that claim?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a good question because we're taught that Scripture, is true, and I believe it is true. And so we think that the face value, interpreting these numbers at face value, is the right thing to do because I believe in what we call the perspicuity of Scripture, or even the sufficiency of Scripture, that Scripture in itself is sufficient and is understandable. And we believe in that everybody should be able to read the Bible and understand it. It should make sense to people. And we're also brought up in our culture to believe that mathematics, that numbers are the universal language. That 2 + 2 is 4 in every culture, in every language, everywhere on earth, every time in history, even out to outer space. And so we think, okay, I can understand that words change their meaning over time, but not numbers, right? Numbers must stay the same. Actually, that's not true. Numbers do change. People in different cultures and different times do use numbers differently than we do. In our culture, accuracy is paramount. That's not true in other cultures and at other times.
And as we pointed out, the Sumerian King's list is a perfect example of that. And so we can't deny the evidence that we have in the ground in archaeology. So our key is, how do we understand numbers as they did in the ancient Near East? And we have to put ourselves back in that time. And I always talk to my students, it has to be understandable to the people that read it. And this is what we're doing here.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's the principle of quote-unquote literal interpretation. The literal interpretation is the interpretation that the original writer and the original readers understood it as, not reading a text through our modern lenses. Yes. And so I don't use the word literal because sometimes, people are like, you're not taking these numbers literally. Well, I think I am. Because actually taking them at face value undermines Scripture, because it undermines the historicity of Genesis, because it doesn't match history. You have people living way too long in cities that didn't exist, and we haven't talked about this yet, but they're practicing a cultural, phenomenon and cultural practices that weren't even invented yet. So, you have to, understand and read the Bible in light of how it was understood then, and that the Bible should be in concord or in agreement with history and with archaeology.
Could this affect our ideas of dating in archaeology and dating in early date, late date for everything and those kinds of things? Exactly.
So a lot of people still follow the method of Archbishop Usher, and you've heard of the Usherian chronology. Archbishop Usher was in the 1750, around about there, wrote a chronology that was printed in the King James Bible for hundreds of years. And nobody holds to his chronology anymore, but they hold to the same method, which he used, which is, now he did try and correlate the biblical timeline and chronology with other ancient Near Eastern sources as best he could. And he did have some things to correlate it to. And pretty much back to the time of the kings of Israel and Judah, he was pretty close. Before that, he didn't have anything. And so he took these numbers at face value, added them together, and had Abraham being born 2166 and dying in 1806 BC. Well, that puts Abraham living during the Intermediate Bronze Age that we call today and the Middle Bronze One. That simply cannot be. The cities are not there. Abraham visits Jerusalem and King Melchizedek. Jerusalem was not a walled city during the Intermediate Bronze Age, and didn't start until really 1800 BC to where it was a walled city. Middle Bronze too, but not just Jerusalem. The other cities are not there. Shechem and Hebron, the cities that Abraham was supposed to visit weren't there during the Intermediate Bronze. And so if you're taking these lifespans at face value and coming up with a chronology, you're almost admitting to say, okay, I'm okay with this being a fairy tale. Well, I'm not okay with that. I think the Bible is true. I think that these were real people who lived in real cities and who practiced cultural practices that are listed in Scripture, that we see in other ancient Near Eastern documents. And that all does fit a certain time, but it doesn't fit the Intermediate Bronze and the Middle Bronze one, from 2200, 2100 to about 1850. It fits after that in the Middle Bronze too. And so I think you're undermining scriptures. Now, what people will say, people love to say this, hey, Scripture has always proved the critics wrong. Okay, you've heard this, right?
Yeah.
The critics used to say there was no house of David, there was no Davidic kingdom, and then we found the Tel Dan stealer, right? And there's example after example. Well, they're 100% right. I agree with all of that, but that's only half the story, because the other side is that often science or archaeology has helped us correct mistaken biblical interpretations. You want an example? Have you ever heard of Galileo? Right? So, biblical interpretation for years was that the sun went around the earth. And Galileo came along, among others, and said, no, the earth goes around the sun. But the Bible literally says the Lord fixes the earth and it does not move. That's what it says in Psalms. How can you misinterpret that? That's what it literally says. But yet we found out that no, in actual fact, we were misinterpreting that verse in Scripture. The earth does go around the sun. The earth does move. And the sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. The earth rotates. It looks to us like the sun rises and the sun sets.
And I think probably one of the areas of misunderstanding in interpretation is that the genre matters. Whether we're talking about a narrative passage, prophetic passage, poetry, all of that is significant in how we understand. So it's not a matter of taking, everything in a using that word literal sense. Literal does mean understanding the genre or the kind of literature we're talking about when we're interpreting those passages.
Yeah, exactly. And people can understand that when it comes to words. They can understand poetry and narrative and didactic or teaching Scripture. They have a harder time when it comes to numbers. And so I talk about this as it's the biblical problem you've never heard about. But once I tell people these numbers are symbolic, that they're not meant to be read literalistically as actual lifespans, people can understand it, but they have a hard time accepting it because it's not what they've heard growing up. It's not what they've been brought up with. And so it's a problem people can understand, but then they've got to start thinking through. But once you do that, once you take these numbers that was my computer.
No problem.
Once you realize that these numbers should be interpreted as the ancient people understood them and interpreted them, and you realize they're not there to make a chronology, they're there to give their ancestors honor, then you're free to look at the period of the patriarchs and look at the flood and creation and talk about them in terms of where they actually fit, in terms of where the archaeology, where the evidence on the ground makes them fit. Exactly. Not in terms of these, forcing this chronology onto Scripture.
So you think this can actually help us with our synchronization of archaeology and dating?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, it helps us. Yeah, it helps us with these cities that I've been talking about. And you and I dug at Tel El Hammam, which we believe is biblical Sodom. We know that site, whether you believe this is Sodom or not, we know that site was the largest, wealthiest, most prosperous city in the region, and that it was destroyed by this fiery cataclysm from heaven around 1700, 1750 BC. We know that fits the biblical story. Okay, so if it is Sodom, it fits something during the lifetime of the patriarchs, because this is when Abraham lived, this is when Lot lived, his nephew. So we know that. But then we talk about the other cities. We talk about Jerusalem. Like I say, it was not a walled city before 1800 BC. So if Abraham's visiting a king, Melchizedek, in Salem, Jerusalem, it has to be after 1800 BC. We talk about the other cities. Beersheba is a little bit of a difficult conundrum, but there's certainly nothing at Beersheba before the Iron Age. But I believe that there could be something in the Bronze Age. But then the other cities too, Shechem, Hebron, these other ones that we mentioned, everything starts to fit together when you realize these numbers are not what we need to use to form the chronology, because not only do the numbers not work, the ages, nobody used a chronology. Nobody asked that question of, nobody woke up, these shepherds in the ancient world woke up and got out of their tent and said, you know what I need? I need a chronologically accurate history of the entire world back to creation. They simply didn't think that way. And nobody did until they started getting to the Greek era.
So maybe we can go back and look at how do we get our numbers then? How do we have to have a baseline. We have to have something consistent for us as archaeologists to work with numbers. We're saying right now we can't trust the numbers that are in these ancient texts because they're symbolical. So now how do we shift to accurate numbers?
Mm-hmm. Do you mean in the archaeology or in the biblical text?
Oh, in archaeology. So we can trust numbers. Or what do we pin our numbers on then if we can't trust the ancient text?
Right. Yeah, and so in archaeology, as you know, and you've talked about this, I'm sure.
Yes.
Dating is one of the big things that we do, and we do it based on the pottery, the different forms of pottery. We do it on carbon dating of organic matter. And so people have been quick to throw shade on this and say, oh, that carbon dating is not accurate, carbon dating is not good. But we know the pottery very, very well. Right. And that's one of the main things you do in archaeology. And, I got the privilege to dig with you in your square, David. And I will tell you, what you find is you find a lot of pottery. They call it the Bronze Age, but it's pottery is what you find. You find pottery everywhere. Yeah. And, so what we're finding if you go back the last 50 years or 100 years in archaeology, we're not finding that they're coming up with new discoveries and throwing out the old dates. We're finding that carbon dating and even more discoveries in pottery are simply refining the dates that we have. The dates that we have, I think we're on a fairly solid basis to say we pretty much understand the dates in the ancient world based on archaeology. Now, will we find more as we dig more? Of course we will. But the progress that we've made has shown that we're really just refining and making small changes to our dates now. 200 years ago, archaeology was in its infancy, and we were coming up with new discoveries all the time that were changing things. The last, you know this more than I do, probably 50 years, we can be fairly certain that what we're going to find is simply going to confirm what we already know. It may refine it, it may change it slightly. Now, what people like to say, this is an argument people like to say, and you've heard this probably.
No doubt.
Absence of evidence does not mean Evidence of absence.
Evidence of absence. I said it last week.
Yeah, evidence of absence. Absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. And what they mean is just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it isn't there, right? Just because we haven't found a 900-year-old skeleton doesn't mean it isn't there. It could be there. We've only found a very small percentage of everything that we can find, right? Absolutely, 100%. But that saying only applies in certain circumstances. In a lot of cases, absence of evidence does indeed infer evidence of absence. If I was to say to you, there's a flea in this room, you would say, well, I don't see a flea. I would say, well, absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. There still could be a flea. But if I say to you, there's an elephant in this room, you can't use the same argument. You can't say, well, I don't see an elephant, but it could still be here. No, it couldn't. You know, and in this case, I think we've reached a point in our archaeology and in our dating through the pottery and through carbon dating that where we can say, no, we have a good idea of the dates of things. Will things change a little? Of course. And, you know, we will discover more. Absolutely. But I think what we'll find will refine the dates that we already know in terms of archaeology.
Now, some might respond, we know about the Egyptian pharaohs. So how do they fit into our understanding of dating in this argument?
Yeah, the Egyptian pharaohs are a good example because there we have, and I argued that Turin Canon has exaggerated numbers. But when you get to the pharaohs, they actually, the documentary, the history shows that they lived normal lifespans and had normal reigns. Now, some of them were long. Pepi II was long and may have lived into his 90s. Okay, he was the pharaoh. He had the best medical treatment available. That's within a normal human lifespan. We don't see in the Egyptian pharaohs, we don't see people living hundreds and hundreds of years. They do that when they talk about their ancient genealogy. And so we find the same thing in Scripture. By the time we get to the kings of Israel and Judah, you know, King Saul and then David and Solomon and then on after that, the Bible records pretty normal lifespans and reigns, and they seem to fit this random, you know, distribution that you would expect of normal lifespans and reigns. Prior to that, you have these symbolic numbers that are used, not just for the lifespans in Genesis. There are some others that are used in Scripture as well. The 480 years from back to the Exodus from the dedication of the temple. It seems pretty clear that's 12 generations. 40 times 12 is what that's referring to. So this was the common pattern that their time frame used, and that should be the default rather than defaulting to they thought the way we do in modern times.
George, do you have any questions to chime in? You've been silent and neglected here.
I think you gentlemen covered quite a bit, actually, and of course, if the listening audience followed you, especially through the Sumerian King list, it gives a picture of the concept of the ancient world and its reflection on the early Genesis narrative, which I can understand what you're saying by doing away with the antiquity of the scripture and giving it such a literal date because of how we see it through our cultural perspectives. What we're doing, I shouldn't say but as a result, we're doing more harm than good. And we're doing things, if I could, like if I take a bishop ushered date, a literal date for, let's say, the flood, I think we end up in the 2400, 2500 BC. That's the same time they're building the pyramids under Khufu.
Right.
How is that possible?
Right.
And we end up with a very young Earth.
Yes.
So as a result, we try to stick dinosaurs on the ark. And it becomes more and more, in my opinion, because I know we're going to get out, hopefully not, because I think you did a very good example of this.
Mhm.
You know, is that it does more harm than good, and actually, in some cases, makes the Bible look absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Let me see if I got some other questions. You did mention something like the 40 days and 40 nights. How it becomes very, because you hear it again and again in the scriptures. And also, you talked about the variance between what we call the Masoretic text and the Septuagint.
Mhm.
And when you just mentioned 480 years, 12 generations of priests, possibly priest being represented as 12 generations as a 40, but the 40 is represent. But then we get to the Septuagint, like you mentioned when you showed the different books,
Mhm.
like you get different numbers.
Number,
So
yeah.
the Exodus in the Septuagint is 440 years. They're leaving out one generation. So we get this variant that, like you said,
Mhm.
it becomes very, very difficult to just, okay, let me just say it this way. If somebody was to, and I know the general population, the laity, if you will, are not aware of this in all fairness.
Right.
But
Correct.
if I'm tempted to jump on a bandwagon, such as the Septuagint, understand we have a Masoretic text. There's more than one bandwagon out there to jump on.
Right. Yeah.
So it makes it extremely difficult. Let me see if also when you talk about archaeology and you
Mhm.
talk about the lifespan of such as the pharaohs,
Mhm.
but we see, you can say, the human element being involved. Let's say
Mhm.
degeneration of the spine. Let's say tooth decay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Egyptians,
Great
one of
point.
the number one
Right.
problem with Egypt, when we look at the mummies, are the teeth. The
Yeah.
enamel is almost worn completely off.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I've read where, Ramses lived, they believe, to almost like 90 some years, possibly, right?
Mhm.
But in his x-ray of his skull and his mandible, they believe that he died from an impacted tooth.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah. No, you raised some very good points, and I want to address some of them. But you're exactly right. The idea that people lived longer when we didn't have anesthetic, antibiotic, or antiseptic is crazy in my view, and that's just the letter A. you know, falling in a hole and breaking your leg could be fatal, and they did that. They walked everywhere, right? Tooth decay could be fatal. Now, teeth can last a long time. We have teeth from the mummies that have lasted 1,000 years after they died. But it turns out if you actually have to use your teeth for eating, they only last about 30 or 40 years before we invented the toothbrush. Okay, now our teeth last longer. And that's how we can find age usually is dental wear. And so, people lived shorter lifespans, not longer. Now, what I feel like understanding these ages symbolically actually supports the antiquity of the text. And here's my reasoning. People didn't use face value numbers until much later on. And people didn't formulate a chronology until the Greek era. And so the liberal view of the scripture is that these numbers were added much later by you've heard of JEDP. This is the P editor, the last one, or maybe someone even later than them. And these numbers were an addition that were added into the scripture. Now the J editor did have some numbers, but the P editor added a lot and reformulated them. And that they all add up to, if you take the numbers in the Old Testament, they round up to 4,000 years, and they end at AD 164 in the rededication of the temple during the Maccabean era. And so the liberals say these numbers were added later because that's when people were using face value numbers, and that's when they were making a chronology, and it fits a chronology, and these numbers were added later, and so they have a foundation for that belief. The traditionalists say, no, these numbers were added earlier. They were originally part of the text. And when Moses wrote it down, he used, the sources that he put together and the Toledotes that he put together in Genesis. These were original part of the text, but they're face value numbers, which nobody was using at that time. What I'm saying is it makes much more sense that these numbers were original to the text, but they were using hyperbolic, symbolic numbers, which is what they used in ancient times. They weren't using this later chronological Greek system. This means that the text was ancient. These numbers are original in the text, and it was written by, I believe, by Moses after the Exodus and put together the Pentateuch or the Torah. And so
I don't think the average person in our culture understands how in that ancient world they didn't have birthday parties and have birth certificates and put such a focus as we do on numbers. Exactly. And so their understanding of numbers was an entirely different worldview than we. And and there's many examples of these cultural practices that we find in the ancient Near East that we don't share today. And we read some of these passages in Genesis and in the Pentateuch, and boy, these are bizarre practices. Why are they doing this and why are they doing that? Well, they thought differently than we do. So we can't expect them to be thinking the same way we do. We can't interpret it the same way. And that always puts my underwear in a knot when I start hearing people talk about transporting our ideas back to the old world.
Exactly.
That's such a vivid picture. Yeah, thank you.
George.
And they say our generation, we could say like age is just a number, but in the ancient culture, age, there is no number.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And now
my underwear will not end up in a bind. I'm perfectly fine.
and they honored people differently than we do.
Right.
And we know this because this is the way they lived. With the elders were respected more than elders are today in our culture, even.
Exactly. And that's what, as you go through the story of the patriarchs, if you take these numbers at face value, Abraham's still alive, but yet he's not mentioned. And it doesn't mention him ever visiting his grandson, Jacob, where if he's the honored elder, that should be there. You would expect to see that there in Scripture. But people don't also realize that there is a biblical purpose behind assigning these numbers, these ages, in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, that explicitly lists long life as an evidence of God's blessing and of the God. And so that's why I think it's important that Abraham was the first person who was called old, even though according to the face value reading of the numbers, he wasn't that old. But that's important because Scripture wants to point out this is someone that you want to focus on. This is an example of obedience to God and God's hand of blessing on him. After Abraham, there's only 7 other individuals in the Old Testament who are called old. And they are people who are good examples that we should follow. There's Job, Isaac, Joshua, Gideon. Yeah, he's a little bit mixed. Samuel, David, and Jehoiada later on after David. And other people are assigned long lifespans who are, for most part, good examples. There's Levi, Kohath, Amram, Aaron, Moses, Caleb, and Eli. Eli actually is a good example because he's a bad example. So Eli is assigned this long lifespan. He's a priest, but he's a bad priest, and his children are wicked, right? And so the curse against Eli, the judgment against Eli from a prophet of God is no one will reach old age in your line. All will die in the prime of life. Why? Because he's not a good example. He's a bad example. And so Scripture uses these ages, these lifespans, as a way to elevate the right examples and to point out the wrong examples. And there is a method behind this. There is a reason why the Bible uses this. Now, it's using the common format of its day, the ancient format. But yeah, there's a reason behind it. Absolutely.
And we haven't quite figured it all out yet is the other lesson from this. And that's why we continue to explore and do our archaeology and keep on.
And very good point. Very good point. We haven't figured it all out. We think that they're giving honor to their ancestors. There is no text that says we're doing this to give honor to our ancestors. The Sumerian king list seems pretty obvious. And based on the Sumerian king list, it seems obvious too that people knew these were symbolic, honorific numbers. Nobody back then or now, and you mentioned it already, nobody takes 36,000 years and thinks that somebody reigned that long. And so we think that, the same applies in Scripture. They knew people didn't live for 900 something years, but they knew this was a way to give honor. Will we find more information as we do more archaeology? Obviously. And I would love to find more genealogies with numbers on them that will help us understand this even better. We don't know everything. We're making a best educated guess at this time.
And one could argue that this was so well known and so accepted that it didn't need explanation.
Right. And you see that with other things in Scripture. Is that in Genesis is that they talk about cultural practices and they don't explain them, and then that's why we have commentaries and that's why we go to seminary, because to them it was obvious.
Yes.
To us it's not. And I give the example, if I stay at a hotel and I stay in room 1025, does that mean there's 1,025 rooms in that hotel? And you would say no. And I'm like, well, how do you know? Well, of course we know 1025 means you're on the 10th floor. We know that. We just, when I came from New Zealand, when I came to the United States, we went to my sister-in-law's house, and the number on her street her number is 12934. Where I come from, and maybe in Canada, I don't know, the numbers on a street go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We don't have the 1,200 block or the 12,000 block of a street. I was like, what? How many houses are on this street? But the US understands that because they grew up with that. They don't have to explain it.
Exactly.
Maybe one example in our culture about a numbering system, since you're talking about buildings, how many buildings don't include the 13th floor, even if there is one? Mm-hmm. You go from 12 to 14 because some people view it as unlucky. So we don't have 13 floors in some cases. Mm-hmm. Now, that would be hard to explain 2,000 years from now when somebody's digging a building and say, why in the world did they do that?
Right, exactly.
Well,
exactly.
We know. But what's another? Kenneth Kitchen, when he talks about the age of Joseph, 110 years, right?
Right. That's a great example.
We have a symbolism there from another culture, the Egyptian culture, being represented in the biblical text.
Exactly.
And I think that's very interesting. There's a reflection there.
No, exactly. That's a perfect example. Because over 2,000 years of Egyptian history, it's written in several examples that the ideal age, and remember, Egypt had the decimal system. The ideal age was 110. Not that people lived that long, but that their wish was, may you live to be 110, or after someone died, they would say he lived to be 110 years old as a way to give him honor. And so I think it's no coincidence that Joseph, the first generation in Egypt, lives to be 110, and Joshua, the last generation coming out of Egypt, also lives to be 110. I think that's in Scripture for a reason. That's because of that Egyptian example. That's exactly right.
Now, to take it into the New Testament period, where I was doing some research in Revelation, we have the example of 666 in Gematria. So the ancient people were using and thinking of numbers differently than we use and think of them today. So there they represented, the letters in their names with a number and added them up and so on and so forth. So the use of numbers was different in antiquity somewhat to what we have today, although we've given some modern examples.
No, and that's a great example. Another example from the New Testament is in Matthew chapter 1, where Matthew says that there are 14 generations from, Abraham to David, and 14 generations from David to Christ, and it's not 14. We know it's not 14. He's rearranged those numbers to make 14, 14, 14, right? And the reason he did it was because the name David, if you take those letters, adds up to 14. And so he's using gematria. Now, that was used in the New Testament time, and even back to about the earliest examples around in the 8th century BC. We don't have any examples from before that, and so I don't think that that's an explanation for the numbers in Genesis. But yeah, exactly. It's an example of them using numbers in a way that's different than the way we do today. If we were doing a genealogy like Matthew does, we would want to get everyone exactly right. But he doesn't. Deliberately, he puts them into these groups of 14, which his readers would have understood.
Exactly. And I want to emphasize to our readers, we're not arguing that the biblical text is not historical, just the opposite. We're not arguing that the Bible is not inspired, just the opposite. So we need to be cautious that we don't, the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. And just because we take a different perspective on it doesn't destroy our belief in the accuracy and historicity of the scripture. Exactly.
Yeah, what we're saying is the Bible is accurate. These were real people during the patriarchal era. They did live in real cities that existed. These events happened. So we're saying it is historical, and I've lost my train of thought right there.
Well, the use of numbers is different.
The use of numbers is different, exactly. And and there is a biblical purpose behind it.
Yeah. George, do you want to take us out?
Well, you know what? We've all been agreeing, but nobody's played the devil's advocate here as far as taking the numbers. I know you didn't want to use the word literal. Let's say that not symbolically. Let's take it for the actual numerical value of the number. And I feel that because I take the text to mean what it is, it's infallible. So if we start messing with those numbers, that's going to start messing with the text. And it just doesn't sit well with me because, that's how I grew up in my church. That's what I've learned. And how come the Bible gets these numbers and it gives us numbers to begin with, and those are incorrect, but then later on in the Bible, those numbers are correct? That doesn't seem right to me.
No, you raise a very good point, and the point is the response to that is what we call the word is accommodation. God has to accommodate his communication to a human audience, and this is true in everything, in every time period. Even today, we think we are so smart and we know so much, and we do know a lot more than previous generations, absolutely. But even today, God's communication to us has to accommodate to what we know and we understand. And it was the same in the ancient world. Every time God speaks in Scripture, and Scripture is written over 1,500 years, remember, in different cultures and different languages. And so every time God communicates something about himself or about the universe or about sin or about, whatever he's talking about, God has to put it in a way that his audience can understand. And so and they use the word condescend. God has to condescend in his communication to finite man. And so that means using the language, human language, using the idioms, using the formats of the audience that God is speaking to. So that's the case here, is that when God's talking to an ancient audience about to enter the land of Israel after the Exodus, that's one audience, okay? Later on in the New Testament, he's talking to, there's a Greek-speaking audience living in New Testament times under Roman rule. It's a very different audience. So in either case, God has to condescend. God has to accommodate his communication using the communication techniques of his audience so that they understand it. That's what inspiration is. If your theory of inspiration is not dictation, your theory of inspiration is that God has to communicate.
One of my professors used to say, God speaks understandably to man.
Exactly.
And I think that's what you're trying to express there. And yeah.
Okay, my next question would be, I'm kind of trying to think in the realm of the listening audience a little bit. And okay, let's say that if these numbers are honorific and we don't have literal numbers or dates to begin with, or we don't have just literal dates, then how we date the chronology of the early biblical text, the time of the patriarchs, becomes arbitrary. So what is Abraham's date? What is Joseph's date for birth? Then how do we add these things up to get a biblical chronology? We just can't by using the biblical text and the numbers.
Yeah, but the text was never intended to give us a chronology. That's what I'm saying. The whole idea of a chronology wasn't even invented until 200, 300 BC. So you're taking a later practice that wasn't invented, you're imposing it on scripture that was written 1,000 years earlier, depending on your date of the Exodus. And I'm not going to go into that, okay? We're not going to talk about the date of the Exodus, okay? So you're taking a later cultural practice that wasn't even invented and you're superimposing it on text 1,000 years earlier. Now, it is true, and people have, it is true that from about the time of Christ, that Jewish historians and Christian historians took these numbers at face value. Archbishop Usher wasn't the first. There were a lot before him, both Jewish and Christian. Eusebius was a big one that came up with chronologies taking these numbers at face value from around the time of Christ. In the Christian world, the first one came out around 200 AD. In the Jewish world, the first chronology came around 200 BC. So from that time, about 2,000 years till today, that's been the way of interpreting the numbers. And so people look at me and they say, who are you? You want to change what we've been doing for 2,000 years? You have hubris, and hubris means pride, by the way. I looked that up. So who are you? I mean, and I'm saying, no. What I'm trying to do is take us back 1,000 years before that. Yes, that was how people interpreted it from the time of Christ for the next 2,000 years. But before that, 1,000 years before that, that's not how people understood these numbers. And archaeology has helped us recover the original understanding and the original meaning of these numbers.
Well, since we don't have numbers, and you just mentioned using the idea of the honorific dating, so we don't have literal numbers, then archaeologists possibly help us out by looking at the material culture and the culture that's mentioned along with the individuals in the Bible. So let's say they mention certain things, like we would say, like bronze or iron, or maybe a certain type of writing system, or cross-cultural. They mention other groups of people, or a migration pattern. So we might think of the Hyksos, and we might think the migration of
George, cultural
West
practices.
Asiatics. Go ahead.
Cultural practices such as
Cultural practices.
an heir, or the practice of the structure of the Serenity Treaty, or the cost of a slave. That we can pinpoint cultural practices from ancient texts paralleling with scripture, so we can correlate dating more accurately.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, they discovered the Maori tablets and the Nuzi archives, and there was a lot of enthusiasm where they tried to match these things with scripture, and some of those things have been shown to be false. Okay, that's true. But there are other things that do match. And you're exactly right. The long range of travel, the long distance marriages that we see in Genesis, personal names. You mentioned inheritance laws. Your heir, who gets what. The price of slaves is one. The form of treaties changed over time. The price of slaves changed over time. And all of those things narrow down the time of the patriarchs to the Middle Bronze II era, not earlier. And so those cultural practices fit. Now, it's true the cultural practices were practiced over a longer period of time and in different areas, and they're not as precise as we may want. But when the cultural practices align and the archaeology of the cities align, then that seems to make sense to say, wait a minute, we have a pretty good idea of when these people lived and when these events happened.
Yeah. Kenneth Kitchen did a great job in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament, focusing. And I mean, I based part of my PhD research on the suzerainty treaty structure, and it changed over time. And we know exactly when, the patriarchal narratives were written, second millennium BC, because the pattern is identical, and it changed later. It was a different structure, the same suzerainty treaty, but different structure. And then, of course, he documents this idea of the inflation with the cost of a slave.
Right.
Joseph's fallen for. So we can parallel those ideas, which are monetary, and they do show a difference over time with inflation. We all know about inflation, so it wasn't no different in the ancient Near East.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So the dates we don't have to rely on, and still have reliable information. We can rely on other issues such as these social structures and.
Right, and then the patriarchs become real people. They're using cultural practices of that time, living in cities that did exist.
Yeah.
And the stories become real, and they're not, like I say, a fairy tale put in a different time when they couldn't possibly have happened.
Exactly.
Okay.
George, any more? Do you have any more?
Let me think. Maybe one more. Because if I look like I was rude, I wasn't being rude. I'm sitting taking notes. And the statement that we hear a lot in archaeology, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And I think this is one of the few times where I hear that it possibly is overused, overstated. I can say my son could use it. I said, Johnny, there is no Santa Claus. But just because you couldn't find his house doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Well, Johnny, there's no such thing as flying reindeer. Just because you haven't found a flying reindeer doesn't mean there wasn't a flying reindeer. I mean, how far do somebody want to take that, actually? And so I think within reason, when we look at archaeology, we compare the material culture, and we do have dialogue. We don't all agree, but we do have dialogue. So we try to come up with some somewhat agreeable medium. But I think what we come together and done today, and you have your book on you, Dr. Olsen?
I do.
I just want to hold it. I don't think we've seen it yet.
Oh,
maybe briefly.
This
is what it's called, folks. It's How Old Was Father Abraham? And then underneath, if you can't read it, the Genesis lifespan in the light of archaeology. And it is explaining in much more detail than just what we can do in an hour.
Yeah, exactly. So it's available in lots of different places, and you can buy it online. I should say too, I'm donating all my royalties on this. I'm not pushing this so that I make money on this. I'm pushing it because I just believe it's an idea that people need to be talking about and thinking about. Like I say, a lot of people have not thought about this before, and when they first hear it, they think, well, I don't know if I can accept that. Well, take a look at the book, walk through the steps, and see how you think. If you agree, fine. If you disagree, that's fine too. Let's talk about it. I just think this is an important topic that we need to confront.
Great.
Very well. Anything else, gentlemen, before we end the program here?
Well, I just want to say, Craig, it's been great to see you again. It's been long years.
Mm-hmm.
Had some fun times together in the square. Along with George, you also shared my square in a different season. So
That's right.
yeah.
He was the square supervisor for both of us. That means he's older than both of us.
And wiser.
Well, I don't know about wiser, but certainly a little older. But really great to see you gentlemen again and catch up on old times.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, guys. Thank you both for the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff, and I would love the opportunity to come back again if there's a response and people want to talk about this some more. I would love to do that. And it's great to see you again, David. Great to meet you, George. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Doctor, for your time. And when I get the book, I'll definitely read it because I'm sure there's going to be more in there that we haven't had a chance to discuss. And also, people, I'd recommend it too. Whether maybe you're still on the I'll just use the word literal dates. I was too for the longest time, and then I got into archaeology. This is where I received my PhD, and I found out that this could be problematic. And I think if you read the book, it'll help you out. Not that I'm trying to force you a different direction or anything, but I just think this would be a wonderful way to get an answer, to get a grip on this number issue. Well, people, I once again, thank you so much for your time. This is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down. Thanks for subscribing. We're over 68,000 subscribers, and I really appreciate that. Y'all, I'm from Southern Ohio. Y'all have a good day. Everybody have a good day. Thank you very much.